Hello, and welcome to the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Tim Smith, and I'm the historian here. And I hope everybody has an opportunity while you're here to visit our Gettysburg Beyond the Battle Museum. But today's speaker is Tom McMillan. A lifelong student of history, Tom has served on the Board of Trustees of the Pittsburgh's Heinz History Center, the Board of Directors of the Friends of Flight 93 National Memorial, and the Marketing Committee of the Gettysburg Foundation. He has written 3 previous books to this one, including Flight 93, The Story, the Aftermath, and the Legacy of American Courage on 9/11. McMillan recently retired after 43 years in sports communication, which included 25 years as the Vice President of Communications of the NHL's Pittsburgh Penguins. He has a journalism degree from Point Park University and resides with his family in Philadelphia. And, oh, okay, that is not Philadelphia, is it? Okay, Pittsburgh. And his book is a recent winner of the Bachelder-Coddington Book Award. So without further ado, Tom McMillan from Pittsburgh.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, you can't let that Philadelphia-Pittsburgh thing go. It's great to be here, first of all, and see so many friendly faces. And, you know, I did a lot of research for this book at the old Adams County Historical Society, that cramped little white house. You get in there and it's a little dark, and staff was great, treasure trove of information. But to now see this, to where people can come not only to this fabulous museum and this place where you can do research, it's just an amazing accomplishment. So congratulations to Andrew Dalton and his staff. People often ask how this book came about, because if you heard, most of my career was in sports communications. Well, I'd been coming to Gettysburg for 30 years, but about 10 years ago, I wrote a book on Flight 93, the September 11th flight that crashed in Somerset County, just through a quirk of circumstances that came about. And it was pretty successful, and I learned how to do it. So I thought, well, you love Gettysburg and the Civil War. Why not try to write something about that? But was there a fresh topic? I mean, there are 5,000 books written about Gettysburg. So, and I wasn't the kind of writer who was I was going to write about maybe the 10th person to write about the operations on the second day, or the 50th book on Little Round Top. I'll read those, but that isn't my type of writing. And little did I realize that there was a topic that was staring me in the face all these years. If you go down the Emmitsburg Road to the intersection with the Wheatfield Road, you will see a mundane iron tablet that says simply Wentz House. No one goes there. Looks like almost nothing's there. And across the street is one of the most visited places on the field, the peach orchard, and in the background you can see the famed Sherfy Barn and Sherfy House. But if you look closely there in the back, there's an irregular stone foundation, and that in July of 1863 was the home of John Wentz, his wife Mary, and their youngest adult daughter Susan. John had purchased that property in 1836, coming over from York County. Family much larger back then, many more young children, including a 9-year-old son named Henry. And Henry once grew up on that property and hunted and fished and knew all the streams and the trails and the landscape. Now, about 600 yards to the west, almost directly to the west, is another mundane iron tablet, the kind the War Department put up turn of the century, 20th century, to mark troop positions. Taylor's Battery, Taylor's Virginia Battery, Army of Northern Virginia. And this, on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, was the position of Confederate Artillery Sergeant Henry Wentz. Not only 600 yards from the house where he grew up, but where his parents still lived, and where, although he didn't know it, his dad had chosen to ride out to battle in the cellar. His dad was still in the house. Very little written about this. Harry Fons, in his epic book on the second day, has a couple of sentences, that's all. And he called it a tantalizing mystery. So I thought, well, maybe somebody can look into that someday. I was aware of another Gettysburg guy who had fought for the Confederate Army in this battle, a little more famous, Wesley Culp, of the prolific Culp family of Gettysburg, Culp Farm, Culp's Hill. 1860 Gettysburg census, there were 70 people named Culp in this little borough. Wesley had gone south in the 1850s for work. He joined a militia unit. That unit became part of the Confederate Army. And lo and behold, here he was coming back to Gettysburg in the summer of 1863. Now, there's a legend there, story and a legend that's become quite popular. Wesley was killed in battle here. And as you can still read on some of the placards in town, it says he was killed on July 3rd on Culp's Hill, which is described as a farm owned by his uncle. And the only thing true about that is he was killed. He was killed on July 2nd, not July 3rd. It was on or near Wolf Hill, not Culp's Hill, and Culp's Hill was owned by, wasn't his uncle, a much more distant relative. So it's a pretty good story anyway, but it goes against the legend that you may have heard. So that was actually exciting to deal with that. So I had two guys, and I was talking to my literary agent, and I had a couple of book ideas. The other two weren't on the Civil War, and he said, "No, I think you should try the Gettysburg book. You really like that. Is there enough book-length material?" I said, "I don't know." So I had to start researching. To the extent that Wesley Culp is written about, it's that he went south with his employer, a Gettysburg carriage maker named Charles William Hoffman, C.W. Hoffman. So I have to look into him. 1850 Gettysburg census, and census reports tell you a lot. 1850 census, C.W. Hoffman has 3 sons who, if you add 10 or 11 years to their age, would have been old enough to be Civil War soldiers. So I went to the National Archives, and sure enough, Robert, Frank, and Wesley Hoffman, all born in Gettysburg, all raised on the second block of Chambersburg Street, were not only in the Confederate Army, but part of Robert E. Lee's massive 75,000-man force who came north for the Great Invasion of the summer of 1863. So now I've got 5. Now, we know there are many cases where men from the North fought for the South, men from the South fought for the North, for lots of different reasons. But these guys, to me, were different. They were from here. They were foreign invaders in their hometown. That can't have happened much in the history of the world. Because it happened in the Civil War, which means so much to us, and the Battle of Gettysburg, which obviously means so much to us, most famous battle, I thought it was worth another look. So here are the guys that I call the Gettysburg Rebels. Henry Wentz in the artillery, Wesley Culp and Robert Hoffman, both in the same infantry unit, Company B of the 2nd Virginia. Frank Hoffman in the artillery, Wesley Hoffman in the cavalry. They cover all 3 branches. What struck me very early on is there is no evidence that Robert E. Lee or any of his senior commanders had any idea they had 5 guys from Gettysburg in the Army. That's an incredible lack of communication and coordination, because it was commonplace in the Confederate Army at the time. If they were on campaign near Richmond or Fredericksburg, and there was a local man in the ranks, they would temporarily pull him out of the ranks and attach him to staff as a scout or guide. Makes sense, right? I mean, James Longstreet did it, Stonewall Jackson did it. It's how Jackson pulled off the flank march at Chancellorsville. He had a man who was said to know every hog path. But it didn't happen here, and the thing that hit me, these guys were not great soldiers. 4 never rose above the rank of private. 1 made it all the way to sergeant. But they would not have gotten lost. We know a couple of times the Confederate Army either was lost or confused by terrain. Early morning, July 2nd, Samuel Johnston's reconnaissance. Where did Johnston get? Who knows? I mean, it's all over the place. There's modern research. Nobody knows where he got. Did he get to Little Round Top? Maybe. If it was one of these guys, they would have known where they were. And that afternoon, as James Longstreet is getting into position to execute Robert E. Lee's plans, he's told to shield his troops from Union signalmen on Little Round Top or any other Union troops in the area. They come over, as we know, bald rise, and they're seen. Invectives are hurled. They have to countermarch. It cost them several miles and several hours. But there was one small Confederate unit that made into position on time that day. It was the artillery under E.P. Alexander, 26 guns with horses, big guns. Alexander said, "We zigzagged through the fields, found an old farm lane, got into position, and waited several hours for the infantry." Is it just a coincidence that the only Confederate unit that got into position that day had in its ranks a man from Gettysburg named Henry Wentz, who lived just across the way? There's no proof of that. Wentz wrote nothing about his Civil War experiences, or if he did, nothing exists. Alexander, as you know, wrote a lot. He never mentioned this particular incident, never mentioned Wentz. He was a trained engineer from West Point. He could have done this on his own, maybe. But I've always believed that the only Confederate unit that got into there on time that day, it was because Henry Wentz had something to do with it. So as I'm doing the research for this and continue on, there's not a lot out there. I was really piecing it together. That was part of the fun, but part of the challenge. I talked to a couple of guides who were friends, and nobody really knew too much about this, but my friend Wayne Mott's, legendary guide, current president of the Gettysburg Foundation, said, Tom, these aren't well-known guys. You really need to get their photos for the readers. So I worked hard at that. Photo of Wesley Culp, you've probably seen that. That's been published numerous times, taken 61 or 62. Here are the photos of the other four. They don't exist, or at least I couldn't find them. I tracked down at least 9 descendants, and nobody had one. I was hoping maybe when the book came out that somebody would run up in the attic or the basement and say, now I know who that was, but that hasn't happened. So I told Wayne, I'm going ahead and writing it anyway. I've done enough work. I'm not going to let the photos. I wish I could have found them. Still wish I could find one, but I think it's a reminder, though, most of our books are written about generals or battlefield heroes. Their families save all their documents and their photos. These guys were just regular schmucks. There wasn't a lot saved about them, and that was, part of the intrigue of this story. There's Wesley again. We'll begin the story proper with him. Born in July of 1839 in Adams County, not in Gettysburg, but his family, as you know, had deep Gettysburg roots. Here 4 generations since the Revolution. His father, Wesley Culp, had been born here, raised here, started his tailoring business here, started his family here. Wesley's older brother, William, was born in Gettysburg. But for whatever reason, in the 1830s, Esaias moves his tailor shop more than 10 miles away to a place then called Petersburg, now York Springs, and that is where Wesley's born and spends the first 8 years of his life. They're back in Gettysburg in 1847. How do we know that? It's not a census year. Newspaper ads. You can follow businessmen in the 19th century through their newspaper ads. If you wanted to get word about your business out there, you couldn't produce a television commercial, you couldn't post it on Instagram, you had to buy a newspaper ad. So it's really been a tool for researchers. And I found this ad where Wesley Culp is opening a new tailoring establishment on Baltimore Street. So that's how we know the family is back here in 1847. And Wesley lives here from 1847 to 1856, from the time he's about 8 to the time he's about 17. Why does he leave? He moves south with his employer, Charles William Hoffman, so I have to really look into him again. And my wife, Colleen, is a very dogged researcher, much better than I, much more patient than I. She was helping with a lot of this research. And she said, I think CW is a really key part of this story. And I said, nah, he's not. He's just a transitional figure. We're going to bruise over it. She said, no, I think he's right. And I see some folks in the audience who were with us on Stu Dempsey's European tours, Battle of the Bulge in Normandy recently. They will not be surprised to know that Colleen was right and I was wrong. Because this guy's a very key part of this story. He was much more, friends are laughing, thank you, Paul. It is true. He was much more than a carriage maker. He was a carriage maker. I mean, you see this ad. Again, you're finding ads. Here he is. He's moving his shop to Chambersburg Street. But this guy was one of the most important citizens of Gettysburg in the 1840s and 1850s, right up there with the great names you've heard. He's been written out of history, the town's history, because he went south and became a Confederate sympathizer. But consider, he owned multiple businesses. He owned at least 10 pieces of property. He was elected 3 times to Gettysburg Borough Council. He was a trustee of the Methodist Episcopal Church. He was on the local temperance committee, went to the state temperance convention, meant he was one of the leading teetotalers in town. He wouldn't be happy that the Gary Owen Irish Tavern is on or near his property. Colleen and I toast him every time we're there. And he also was part of a group of esteemed citizens who in the mid-1850s founded and created a new cemetery in town. 2 words back then, Evergreen Cemetery, which is why we have the battlefield landmark Cemetery Hill. So we know that he moves south in 1856. Why? In 1854, 2 years earlier, he runs for and is elected to a 3-year term on Borough Council. He opens a new steam mill on Franklin Street. Those aren't the signs of someone who's looking to leave. So why did he leave town? I would ask around, again, not many people knew much about this story, and they said, well, the carriage business, the big market was down in Virginia. Maybe he just went to where the market was. And I probably would have written that if I had not been at the old ACHS looking through Methodist church records, because he was a trustee. And by doing that, I found a cure for insomnia. Folks, if you ever can't sleep, just go to the ACHS and ask for Methodist church records from the 1850s. It'll try to sleep. But I did nod ahead long enough to find this very intriguing piece, and it really changed the tenor of the book. On Monday, the 26th day of June last, said C.W. Hoffman imprudently and unnecessarily engaged with one John Barrett in a cruel fight by striking with a stick or club, throwing stones, and striking with iron. Hoffman using the stick and stones, and Barrett using the iron with the intention of doing severe bodily harm, and in which both were badly injured, all of which showed highly improper conduct and sinful tempers and actions on the part of said C.W. Hoffman, and shamefully outraged the cause of God. The sitting borough councilman and church trustee beat the crap out of somebody. He was arrested, charged, convicted, fined, humiliated. There's no explanation given, but I believe here 2 + 2 = 4. I believe this started his move that he knew he had to get out of Gettysburg. Early the next year, 1855, he is suddenly off borough council. Doesn't say whether he resigned or was thrown off, but he's off. And he places an ad in the paper saying he's going to be putting up one of his pieces of property up for sale. He's going to be leaving in a year. And sure enough, spring of 1856, we have documents, deed documents, that he purchased property down in Shepherdstown, then Virginia and now West Virginia, to move his carriage business there. It must have been an incredibly noisy spectacle on Chambersburg Street, where he's moving all that stuff and all those people out of town, and he takes with him 3 future Confederate soldiers, his 3 sons and Wesley Culp. Now they get to Shepherdstown, and the 2 older boys, the first thing they do is join a militia unit. Robert Hoffman and Wesley Culp, they're about 17 years old. Very commonplace, as we know, as this group knows. You got to wear a uniform, carry a gun, march, pretend like you're in the army. You're kind of defending your new hometown. That's good, and it's a social outlet. So it was very important to these guys. The same thing happens in a little town 10 miles away in Martinsburg, then Virginia, now West Virginia. Henry Wentz. He's a little older than these guys. He goes a few years earlier, but he does the same thing. He gets there and he joins a militia unit, the Martinsburg Independent Blues. And we know that militia units were very important to the makeup of the Confederate armies, Confederate and Union armies, but for these guys, it was their first introduction to some sort of combat. The John Brown Raid, 1859, in another nearby town, Harper's Ferry. Shepherdstown, Martinsburg, Harper's Ferry, all in the same area. John Brown, the wide-eyed, wild-haired abolitionist, he's going to have an army, it's 20 men. They're going to break into Harper's Ferry and seize the armory and arsenal and take some prisoners, free some slaves, and forever end the scourge of slavery in America. That was his goal. They do amazingly break in. They seize the armory and arsenal. They take some prisoners. They kill a man. And they create an absolute panic on around the countryside. The folks in Harper's Ferry send messages to nearby towns. Send your militia. Where'd those messages go? Shepherdstown and Martinsburg. We have direct evidence that Robert Hoffman and Henry Wentz were there, and secondary evidence that Wesley Culp was there. The raid also got the attention of President Buchanan down in D.C. He sends a battalion of about 60 Marines up here under the command of a U.S. Army colonel who happened to be back in D.C. visiting his family. So those Marines come north under the command of U.S. Army Colonel Robert E. Lee, second in command, Lieutenant James Jewel Brown Stewart. So Lee and Stewart lead the U.S. troops up here. They easily capture Brown, and he's tried, convicted, hanged. It was the first time these guys served under or near Robert E. Lee, but it wouldn't be the last. It struck me as we're, I'm just, let me see where we go here, that these guys were in a part of the country where the Civil War was boiling. The issues were boiling 2 years before it broke out. And I think it had to affect them, living where they did, where they moved. But at the same time, they had relatively mundane lives. It wasn't on their minds all the time. There was no 24/7 news outlet. I was able to find a couple of letters to give you a sense of the lifestyle that Wesley Culp wrote home to Gettysburg in the summer of 1860. I got them through the leadership and guidance of the great researcher Bill Frazanito, who has his own wing in this place. In his book, Early Photography, he had tracked down a descendant of the Culp family named Fonstock. So the Fonstock brothers, a Fonstock married a Culp, who had some of this research, and he had passed on, but I found his sons' addresses and wrote them letters, and one said to me, Mr. McMillan, my dad was the historian. But I have his stuff. If you can have access to whatever it was. So I thought he'd let me go to his home near Harrisburg and put on white gloves and look at these letters. Next day, he sends me a text message. Mr. McMillan, I put them in the mail to you. He mailed me 2 1860 letters and about 4 other Culp family documents that they're now safe. Don't worry, they made it. They made it safe. But now he understands what he has, so that's good. I do publish the letter, and this is Wesley's signature. His signature is published for the first time. J. Wesley Culp. His full name was John Wesley Culp. It's just a mundane letter. It's to his sister. How's our father doing? Here's $1 for a new hat. But he does say, next year I plan to go west and seek my fortune. Now, this is July of 1860. 9 months later, as we know, something happens that changes Wesley's life and the lives of hundreds of thousands of other young men forever. The Confederates fire in Fort Sumter, April 12th, and the Civil War breaks out. 3 of these guys are ready almost immediately. Henry Wentz, Robert Hoffman, Wesley Culp are in the Confederate Army within 2 weeks. They've enlisted. Robert and Wesley go with their Shepherdstown militia unit to Harper's Ferry. They become Company B of the 2nd Virginia. They're placed in the 1st Virginia Brigade, and their first commander is a gentleman just arrived from VMI named Thomas Jonathan Jackson. He hadn't earned a nickname Stonewall yet, but this is the very beginning of the famed Stonewall Brigade. Now, the same thing is happening up north. Patriotic men are coming forth to join the armies. On April 20th, the same day that Wesley Culp enlisted in the Confederate Army, his brother William Culp enlists in the Union Army. The Gettysburg men got together. They formed a 3-month regiment, the 2nd Pennsylvania. William Culp, several of Wesley's cousins, and his good boyhood friend, Jack Skelly. Now, those 2 units almost met very early in the war, before First Manassas. There was a little skirmish down in Falling Waters. The Union got the better of it. Wesley Culp was involved in the fighting, such as it was, but Jackson pulled his men back. 2nd Pennsylvania gets there late. But Jack Skelly writes a letter to his mother back in Gettysburg with the bravado of someone who'd never been in battle. They wouldn't stand and fight. We were just giving them what they deserve. But he also said, Wes Culp was with them. He was seen by the people of Martinsburg when they went through. And this is the first time that many people in Gettysburg know that their own little Wesley Culp is fighting for the Confederate Army, and they're not happy about it. Now, I go through they didn't leave a lot of primary sources, so I have to piece things together through letters and tidbits and service records, but I try to pull out some of the quirks of their personalities. Robert Hoffman went AWOL 4 times in the first year and a half of the war. All 4 times, he's allowed back in the Army with little or no punishment. How's that happen? My theory is it had something to do with the old man, C.W. Hoffman. The Shepherdstown carriage-making experiment didn't work too well. He left no impact on that town at all. About 1859, he moves further south into Virginia, buys a 500-acre farm in Fauquier County. After all these years as a carriage maker, he's now going to be a farmer. He becomes a slave owner. That's part of the property that he buys. But he also is a businessman at heart, and I found numerous receipts of him already doing business with the Confederate Army. He's selling food and grain and cows, horses, blacksmithing services, whatever. And the farm was between the lines pretty much. So I think Robert was going home to check on the safety of his parents and his young wife who was living there, but also maybe to help with this minor supply chain operation, and that may have been why the Confederates looked the other way. Now, Wesley Culp's the kind of guy, we all know this kind of guy, crazy things just happened to him. Spring of 1862, he is taken prisoner not once, but twice by the Union Army. Prisoner, released, taken prisoner. The first one doesn't even make it in his military records. We know about it only because of a letter that Jack Skelly's mother wrote to Jack. Now think of this situation. We've heard of brother versus brother, but on West Middle Street, the Skellys lived at what is now 47 West Middle Street. It's not a historic building, but that's the site. Right across the street lived Wesley's sister, Ann Culp Myers. The mother of a Union soldier and the sister of a Confederate soldier were friends, and they talked about the war. Really surreal situation. It brings it home. And this is what she wrote to Jack. Did you know Wes Culp was taken prisoner at Winchester but is released on parole? He wrote to Ann, God only knew what he suffered while he was a prisoner. Do you all pity him? Ann tries to excite sympathy. Do you all pity him? I mean, they clearly weren't getting what this was all about. Now, sometime in late May, Wesley's either trying to get back to his unit or just got there. He's taken prisoner again. He's taken to a prison down in Baltimore, probably Fort McHenry, And by this point, the Gettysburg men had re-enlisted as a 3-year unit, the 87th Pennsylvania. They were posted near Baltimore. William Culp gets word that Wesley's in prison. He gets a pass. The Union brother visits the Confederate brother in prison. He writes about it to Anne back in Gettysburg. She's getting letters from everyone. And he writes, I got a permit from the provost marshal yesterday to visit Wesley. I was with him about 2 hours and a half. He told me to tell you not to be uneasy about him because he is well and will soon get out. I will try to see him as often as I can, but it's hard to get a permit to see anyone in the jail. Now, at about the same time, someone else is taken prisoner. The old man, C.W. Hoffman. Union Army had just about enough of him selling all these goods. So John Geary and his men go, they nab him, they take him to prison. This shows up in the Gettysburg paper on the same day. The arrest of C.W. Hoffman and Wesley Culp on the same day. Here's the actual paper. I have a clearer copies for you, but you see C.W. Hoffman, Wesley Culp. Here's what they say. We learned that C.W. Hoffman, coachmaker, formerly of this place, has been in the rebel army for some time with his three sons, not quite, but he was captured a few days ago near Linden, Virginia by General Geary's command and is now in prison in Washington. How much better to have joined his fortunes with the Union men than send down his name to his posterity as a traitor. Next paragraph. Our young townsman Wesley Culp was taken prisoner at the Battle of Winchester, took the oath of allegiance to the United States, was released, then joined a band of guerrillas and has been captured again. He is good and ripe for summary process, or at least ought to be. Partisan journalism did not begin in the 21st century, folks. Live here in Gettysburg in the 19th century. These guys are not in prison for long. C.W. is out relatively quickly. How do we know that? In July, there were more receipts. He went right back and started selling goods to the Confederate Army. He didn't care. And Wesley's released in a massive prisoner exchange early August of 1862. So we have to jump forward here. We'll go to June of 1863. Robert E. Lee is organizing his massive force for the invasion. It's the first time that all 5 Gettysburg rebels are together. Frank Hoffman with the artillery, Wesley Hoffman with the cavalry, but on other assignments. They're now part of the big group. They're coming north. As we know, they didn't know they were coming to Gettysburg. And part of the Army was tasked with cleaning out a Union garrison at Winchester. Wesley Culp was one of those guys. Big fighting there. And this is where we really have brother versus brother. You hear about it, but this is where we had it. The 87th Pennsylvania against the 2nd Virginia. William Culp against Wesley Culp. It was not a good day for the Union. The Confederates pushed them back. They took 6 battle flags, including the 87th. They took 200 prisoners from the 87th alone, one of which was not William Culp. He somehow escaped and walked back to Gettysburg. He was here for a few days. But the other prisoners were marched through town. And Wesley Culp sees a familiar face. His second cousin, Billy Holdsworth, who later becomes a prominent Gettysburg battlefield guy. Billy, prisoner are you? Anything I can do for you? And Billy says, no, Wes, I'm fine, but Jack Skelly's wounded. He's back on the edge of the woods. Can you go help him? Jack Skelly. So Wes goes and finds him. He gets him taken into town, gets him some medical care, and they have a conversation. And out of this comes another legend of Gettysburg, a great story. As the story goes, Jack gave Wes a message for his fiancée, Jenny Wade. As it was first, pardon me? Okay, whoa, that was right. Okay, sorry about that. Jack gives Wes for his fiancée, Jenny Wade. But as the story was first told, first time it was reported in newspapers and in private Culp family documents, it was a message for Mrs. Skelly. It wasn't written, it was just verbal. Wes was supposed to deliver it. We don't know the full story, never will. That's the last time those guys talked together. Same time, mid-June, Robert Hoffman, he obviously, the AWOL guy, he wasn't the most reliable infantry soldier. So they had placed him in the commissary department. Mid-June, I see in his service records, he's been assigned to drive cattle. I'd never seen that. I looked at a lot of service records, never saw that. But it makes sense. I mean, that's why Lee, one of the reasons Lee was coming north was to get supplies, right? They needed cattle. They needed beef for the Army. Thousands of head of cattle. They're sending half of them back to their supply lines, and half go with them to go with the Army, to feed the Army. So how do we know that Robert was with the Army and not going back south? Because of these receipts that he signed on the morning of June 30th in Carlisle, PA. There he is, Robert Hoffman, 25 head of cattle, and down below his signature for the use of Edward Johnson and the Stonewall Brigade. So he is with them. Now here's a guy who really could have been a scout or a guide. It wouldn't have been pulling an infantryman off the front lines. He wasn't fighting at this point. And he lived in Gettysburg until he was 17 years old. He knew where he was going, but they never did it. So none of these guys are here by the time the battle breaks out on the morning of July 1st. The first to arrive, naturally, was Wesley Culp on the evening at dusk on July 2nd. His unit comes right down Carlisle Street, past the railroad station, past the Majestic Theater, makes a left at the square up near the Hanover Road. How do we know that? Because 50 years later, a reporter from Pittsburgh was doing a story on the 50th anniversary, and he tracked down a man from Shepherdstown who knew Wesley Culp and was in the same unit. His name is Benjamin Pendleton, and this is what he says. We came in on the Carlisle Road, and the head of the column turned left at the square. There were few citizens of the town to be seen, for there had been much fighting in the streets before we arrived. The townspeople made themselves scarce, so that no one welcomed or recognized Wes Culp on his homecoming. These guys go up by the Hanover Road. They camp probably on the Lady Farm. Most of them bunked down. A couple went on a skirmish line. Not Wes. He got a pass to go into town to visit his sister. So his brigade commander, James Walker, Stonewall Brigade, knew he was from Gettysburg. Never passed it up the line, apparently. He even gave Wes an opportunity. He said, you know, if you're a little queasy, this is your hometown. I understand it. You don't have to fight here. I said, no, I'll fight here. I just want to go see my sister. So into town he goes. It's dark. Had to be terrifying. I mean, the Confederates hold the town, but it's a Union town. People have guns. They're not really happy with them. And imagine the Culp sisters when he gets to West Middle Street. The war has just come roaring into their town that day, and now there's a knock on the door. They look outside. There's a guy in a Confederate uniform, and it's their brother. Hugging and kissing and screaming, and he's there for several hours, apparently. They hadn't seen each other for a couple of years. His younger sister gave him a little grief for firing at William. William must have told him about the battle. He wasn't real happy. And they want him to stay. Can you stay overnight? He said, no, I can't do that. But I'll be back tomorrow. I have a message from Mrs. Skelly. And his older sister, Ann Culp-Meyer, said, Wes, we might never see you again. 2 nights later, July 3rd, after Pickett's charge, another Confederate soldier is at the Culp sisters' door. It's Benjamin Pendleton, who knows them very well from their many visits to Shepherdstown before the war to visit Wesley. And he tells them the sad news that their brother has been killed. So he was killed on the morning of July 2nd, shot in the head while on the skirmish line. So being a historian, you have to check them. There's not a lot of writing about the skirmishing out there. So is that true? Yes. It's in the reports of the regimental, brigade, and division commanders. They were skirmishing. The 9th Massachusetts, 27th Indiana talk about skirmishing with Confederate troops up on the Ephraim Dearborn Farm. It's on Montclair Road. It's still there, right near 15. So I think that's where Wesley Culp was fighting and where he was killed. Pendleton tells the sisters that they buried him where he fell, and he describes the tree. They go out a few days later, they can't find him because he told them Culp's Hill. These were Confederates. They'd never been here before. They were misidentifying everything. So the sisters went to the wrong place. They did find his gun butt. Mark W. Culp. Okay, smart guy. How'd they find his gun butt, not his body? Well, my theory on that is Wes was the only guy in his unit killed in the battle. With the lack of equipment in the Confederate Army, there's no way they're leaving a functioning musket lay on the ground. And the 2nd Virginia was at the base of Culp's Hill on July 3rd. So I believe another soldier must have picked it up. What happened to that guy, why the gun was broken, I don't know. But I think that explains that story. Now, we don't know where Wes is buried. The family for years has denied, rumors that he's buried in Evergreen Cemetery secretly, maybe worried about desecration earlier. No word on that. There is a memorial stone for Wesley at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, but there's no record he was buried there. A lot of folks think he might have been buried in Shepherdstown. There's a Confederate cemetery there, but those are mostly Antietam guys. So he may be still out in the field under Route 15. Colleen and I do have a plot at Evergreen Cemetery, and we're right next to the Culp family. Wouldn't it be amazing? And hopefully in 20, 30 years when they're putting me in the ground, they dig down and they find Wesley Culp. That'd be the ultimate research sacrifice. Brian Kennel's here. Brian, you have to notify. They put that in my obituary, so otherwise we don't know. So that's Wesley's story. Now back to Henry Wentz, this tantalizing mystery. Those guys, as you know, Barksdale's moving forward, and they're going after Sickles salient near the peach orchard in the Wentz house. And it's going pretty well, so E.P. Alexander limbers up his artillery, and they're charging forward too. Alexander said it was an amazing sight, one of his favorite sights of the war, to see those guys moving forward. Henry Wentz was not only charging toward his boyhood home, he was also now charging over land that he personally owned. 1850, Bill Frasnito found in the ACHS records, and he led me to them, Mr. Wentz, John Wentz, had bought a 9-acre property diagonally across from the Wentz farm and had transferred ownership to Henry. If you look out there today, this would be between the Warfield property and the road. So over land that he owned, and he ends up pretty much would have gone through the property, ends up about 150 yards north of the house. There is an account that he went in that evening and saw his father. It's a slim account. There's only one that we have, but it's certainly plausible he was there. But it's written by the historian W.C. Storick, who was a young boy from Gettysburg, alive at the time of the battle. He becomes a prominent guide and president of the guides and writes a book. And he also had Wentz family information. His older sister married one of Henry Wentz's nephews, so he might have had information that others didn't have. And Storick writes, on the night of the second day, after Sickles' advance line at the Wentz house had been repulsed and occupied by the forces under General Lee, Henry Wentz visited his old home and was greatly surprised to find his father still there. And that's all he wrote. Damn. That's it. That's all we have. Nothing from Henry. But it's plausible. Next day, July 3rd, we bring Frank Hoffman, another Gettysburg Rebel, onto the field with his artillery unit. They are placed near the Rogers house. Henry Wentz is near the Klingel house. They're part of the grand bombardment before Pickett's charge. There's a quirky thing about that bombardment I'd like to bring up. There's a tombstone. This group probably knows this. This gets oohs and ahs when I'm not in Gettysburg. There's a tombstone that was hit by cannon fire. Not these guys, probably A.P. Hill's Corps. That's Wesley Culp's father. Of all tombstones that have to be hit, this one is hit. So it's just a quirky little story of the many stories of this battle. Now, none of these guys are involved in Pickett's charge, so they charge forward and are repulsed. Wesley Hoffman with the cavalry is involved in the battle at Fairfield later that afternoon. And Henry Wentz's unit, it was said, is one of the last to leave the field that night. Both his immediate commander, Osmond Taylor, and Alexander write about that. They were there almost until dark. Now, Storick has another account that Henry went into the house that night. His dad was asleep, and he left a note on it. That's a little hard to believe, but certainly it was plausible. He was there. He was certainly nearby. So the battle ends. Wesley is left dead on the field. The other four continue to serve through the remainder of the war. 2 of them get wounded. All are taken prisoner. Henry Wentz taken prisoner just a few days before Appomattox. Did they ever come back to Gettysburg? No evidence that any of the Hoffmans ever did. Henry Wentz was back at least once in 1872 to settle his father's estate. His parents had passed. He and 2 of his brothers are here. They're on documents here at the ACHS, those deed documents, and Henry signs them first. So he was here. Nobody wrote anything about it. Once again, there's just so much mystery to this story. Now, some people have asked, did these guys, were they ashamed afterwards? Did they cover it up? Is that why this story isn't well known? No. Henry's the first to die. He dies in 1875 down in Martinsburg, and the Martinsburg paper runs an obituary that identifies him as a proud Confederate soldier whose father owned land on the Gettysburg battlefield. So they knew. The last of the guys to die is Frank Hoffman. He lives all the way to 1920. He's down in D.C. with his adult daughters. And there's a big obituary in the Washington Times. It says, the headline is, Pennsylvania man who fought for the Confederacy. And the story says he came from a prominent family from south central Pennsylvania. The daughters must have provided that information. One of Frank's daughters lived until 1972. Somebody was alive 50 years ago who knew one of these guys. It's not that long ago. How I wish she had written something, but of course she didn't. So this is what we're left with. But it still, to me, is an intriguing story. And that is the story of the men that I call the Gettysburg Rebels. They were on the losing side of the battle, losing side of the war. They certainly were on the wrong side of history, fighting for a government that was going to extend the institution of slavery. We can never forget that when we tell the story. But they were witnesses to and really unique participants in one of the great and cataclysmic events in American history. And on top of that, they were foreign invaders in their hometown. And I just thought their story should be told. So thank you. No questions? Thank you. No. Does anybody have any questions? None? Yes?
Tom, you were working for the Penguins while you were doing this research?
Yes. I'm still working, yes.
It
It took, some of this